I would like to thank the organizers of this seminar for inviting me to give this presentation on the occasion of the 2022/2023 Mellon Sawyer Seminar under the theme, The Afterlives of Slavery and Colonialism. It is such an honor to be here. The title of my presentation is Art in the Reclamation of Benin Heritage Materials. If I have your permission, I would like to dedicate this presentation to one of the few people who had been persistent in clamoring for the return of Benin bronzes, Prince Edun Akenzua, the Enogi of Obazoa, and the younger brother of His Royal Majesty Oba Eredao, the past king of Benin. Unfortunately, he died a few weeks ago. I shall expatiate on his contributions as we go along. You will all agree with me that one of the most discussed topics in the world today is restitution. And these discussions almost always revolve around the Benin bronzes, looted during an historical episode that occurred in 1897 in Benin City in the southern part of what is now known as Nigeria. This led to devastating consequences, killing, plunder, exile, and the dispersal of thousands of Benin heritage materials around the world. The British expedition to Benin represents one of the most documented instances of looting that occurred on the continent of Africa during the colonial period. Today, what we are witnessing as physical returns of Benin heritage materials to Nigeria is a welcome development and has come after several decades of requests made by Benin royals, Nigerian government officials, and civil society groups, as well as European leaders and Western institutions. The Black Lives Matter movement also facilitated restitution efforts through the protest and the removal of monuments that perpetuate the white supremacist ideology seen as relics of traumatic histories in public spaces. What I've set out to do in this presentation is to discuss the role artists have played in moving the discourse on the repatriation of Benin looted art forward. The first segment will focus on artists with cultural connections to Nigeria. The second part will elaborate on some of my advocacy projects on Benin's traumatic history, which I began in 2003. Today, the idea for me is to stress how this artistic engagement or advocacy has brought about awareness, reawakened the consciousness of this historical episode, and brought back to the front burner discussions about Africa's treasures left in Western museums. Artists have made very graphic representations for the return of Benin art, and as the popular saying goes, a picture speaks more than 1,000 words. These interventions, which consist of plays, films, cartoons, paintings, installation art, video, poetry, are ways of using art to recall art and creating platforms for striking a symbolic conversation between the classical arts of Benin and its contemporary expressions. So why have I decided to dedicate this presentation to Prince Edun Akenzua? He was the voice of the Benin Royal Court in matters regarding Benin heritage materials for several decades. Prince Edun Akenzua was nominated by the Oba of Benin in 1996 to serve as chair of the Benin Centenary Committee to organize the commemoration of the British invasion of Benin. Along with other members of the committee, he traveled to Europe to see some of the looted art in museums and to begin the official campaign for their return. It was on one of these visits or trips that the prince met a member of the British Parliament, Benny Grant. In the year 2000, Prince Akenzua, along with Benny Grant, compiled a plea for the case of the return of Benin bronzes to the British House of Commons. Unfortunately, Grant died soon after, and this put paid to all their efforts. In subsequent years, Prince Akenzwa persistently wrote letters of request to museums whenever he heard of exhibitions showing looted Benin art in the West. I am aware of two of such requests written to the Art Institute of Chicago and the Field Museum in Chicago in 2007. As in many cases of requests, these two letters were never responded to or acknowledged. And this brings to mind the poetry recitation by Jumoke Verisimo, titled No Answer, which he rendered in 2014 in Benin City. Indeed, there must be several other requests, and as Benedict Savoy tells us in her submission, there's a lot of information hidden in the archives of the SPK in Germany between 1972 and 1982, as well as in the archives of several Western museums. In 2007, Prince Akenzwa represented the Benin Royal Court in the exhibition titled Benin Kings and Rituals Court Arts from Nigeria, which held in Vienna. The Oba of Benin expressly stated in the introduction to the catalogue that the people of Vienna should show humaneness and magnanimity and return some of the bronzes that found their way to their country. In his opening speech, Prince Akenzwa stated that he felt a great sense of nostalgia looking at the Benin objects which were taken from the bedchamber and palace of his great grandfather, Oba Ovorame. The Benin royals were seeing these objects for the first time, objects that had been in Europe for well over a century. In 2014, Prince Akenzwa facilitated the return of two brass works from a private collection. The items were returned by Dr. Adrian Walker, the grandson of a spy attached to the British Expeditionary Forces that attacked Benin in 1897. Prince Akenzwa's effort at retrieving Benin materials is vital as it represents a significant and coordinated effort at restitution. His writing to selected museums was a spontaneous reaction and deep urge to reclaim looted Benin objects, which he considered very valuable to palace rituals, as had been expressed by his father, Oba Akenzwa II, in 1935, when he made a request to the Benin Museum for two brass tools which he thought were very important for the rituals in the palace. Prince Edward Akenzwa made no pretensions about who the custodians of the Benin materials should be. Benin royals had always taken center stage in requesting for the looted artifacts. From the 1960s onwards, the Nigerian government had made requests for its artifacts. The most popular was for the ivory pectoral mask in 1976 in the British Museum. This mask represents Idia, the mother of the 16th century king Obaesigi. His mother bore the title Ioba Niesigi, mother of Esigi, and was represented by a mask which was chosen as a symbol of the Second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture, FESTAC. The British government declined this request on conservation grounds. And looking back at the time that the federal government of Nigeria requested for this mask, it is very unlikely that they knew that there were four other masks of this kind in other museums. The focus at the time was on the mask in the British Museum, and understandably so, because it was the British that sacked Benin City. From the late 19th century, when Benin cultural materials were transported to the UK, they appeared lost to the continent and were untraceable at the time when there was very little known of the outside world to the people of Benin. Indeed, it was difficult to know where the Benin bronzes were being sold outrightly, exchanged, auctioned, transferred, loaned, photographed, or replicated. I thought I should open by mentioning Prince Akenzwa's role here because when the Cambridge and Aberdeen works were returned to Benin City, he called me on the same day, and that was the last time I heard from him. I congratulated him, telling him I was glad that he was present to witness the return of some of the Benin treasures, and this was his lifelong desire, and in my view, a reward for his dedication to the cause. The recent return of Benin tangible materials have not come from a simple and sudden realization that it is unethical to keep on holding on to looted art. It has occurred because of multiple pressures and negotiations laden with disappointments, pain, and sometimes intrigue. Let us look at some of the recent returns. In October 2021, we witnessed the lovely ceremony of the return of Okboru, or the cockerel, at the Jesus College in Cambridge. The students of the college will be remembered for posterity for insisting to their school administration the importance of returning this ancestral relic, which has been equated with the symbol of a cock on the school's emblem since 1905. And these are the images that were taken at the Benin Palace when the works were returned. So the return of the ancestral head at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland is also worthy of mention. Other landmark events are the July 1st signing of the Declaration in Berlin, where ownership rights to the over 1,000 objects in German collections were transferred to Nigeria, and the physical return of 2 Benin looted arts to Nigeria by the German government. More recently, 31 objects were returned by the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., and Rhodes Island School of Design Museum. I had been invited much earlier to speak about the Benin bronzes at RISD when the idea of the return of the ancestral head was first mooted. While we may commend these several efforts, we cannot say that the physical returns are anything to write home about in terms of number. So I will not dwell on the political side of this debate, but I would like to speak about the flourishing art scene and how artists in various genres have addressed the campaign for Benin treasures. So when we refer to Benin bronzes, what do we really mean? The term has become a generic name for describing the entire Benin corpus, most of which were looted and now appear in museums in the Western world. They comprise a variety of object types: ancestral heads, aquamarines, pendant masks, items of regalia, jewelry, plaques, um, tusks, idiophones, staffs of office, and many other forms that represent zoomorphic and anthropomorphic forms. They also comprise a large range of media made of iron, of brass, coconut shell, vegetal matter, leather, fabric, ivory, wood, and terracotta or baked clay. In some cases, a single object might be made with as many as 6 or 7 materials, and contrary to the term bronzes, they were made of brass, which is an alloy of copper and zinc. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and because it was a non-ferrous metal, it does not corrode. The Benin treasures were made using a technique that was quite widespread across several centers of casting in Africa, known as the Seripediu or lost wax technique of casting, which is also done in Igboukwu of the 9th century AD and also in Ife of the 12th century AD. To remember and make easy recalls, the Edo people used the term Sayama, which means to cast in bronze, to cast in a permanent medium, or to immortalize an event. Indeed, the bronze works were made to capture historical events in the palace, and as such, they were documents that constitute the archive of the people. These representations reflect the philosophies of the people, their religious beliefs, and their entire worldview. Songs, legends, and proverbs capture historical events. The plaques recounted the deeds of past kings, and ancestral heads or umlau recorded lineage history and were focal points of worship and veneration. So we'll go on to discuss how literary artists recall history through their works. So there are a number of historical plays which are directly connected with the Benin British encounter. They have been published as far back as 1966. The three major historical plays reveal how playwrights choose to memorialize the events of the past. All of these plays have been written and performed at one time or the other. The first one, Enwema Ogeraki's play, titled Oba Ovorame and Oba Ewakbe, is the earliest. And the second one was published in 1974, written by Olarotimi, titled Ovorame Nogbaisi, and became very well known, very popular. And in 1997, The Trials of Oba Ovorame, written by Ahmed Jerima, was performed to mark the centenary commemoration of the British expedition. These plays became a way of reenacting history and elicited various responses from the public and became the subject of a joint paper I wrote in 2004 titled The Politics of Memory in the Dramatic Space, Two Distant Views of Ovoram and Nogbaisi. This paper revealed the complexities associated with narrating a historical play laden with emotions. And here we have the play by Ahmed Yarima. And so we'll go on to look at the filmic representations. And the first was done in 1977, which is The Mask by Eddie Ugboma. It premiered in Lagos, and the storyline was based on an invasion of the British Museum to take the popular ivory mask as a response to the loan requested by the Nigerian government for the 16th century ivory mask representing the Queen Mother. In 2014, the movie Invasion 1897, produced by Lancelot Emasue, was released. And like Eddie Ugboma's uh, film, he breaches the museum security to retrieve some of the looted Benin materials. And a similar storyline is reflected in the blockbuster movie Black Panther, which follows a pattern similar to a locally produced and less publicized film titled Legend of Idia, The Call of the Mask, released a year before Black Panther. Dominic Malakay and Cedric Vincent opined that, and I quote, some of the resemblances between these heist stories may be a function of borrowing or even plagiarism, end of quote. However, what is important is that these filmmakers express a yearning desire for the repatriation of Benin objects. While these attempts are in the realm of fiction, a Congolese activist, Wazulu Diabanza, brings these stories to reality by physically invading museum spaces to remove looted objects which he says belong to Africa. In 2005, Leo Asemota, a British-based Edo artist, launched an elaborate project spanning over 10 years in execution known as the ENDS Project. His work focuses on various aspects of British and Edo history. In his use of photography, video, performance, sculpture, and drawing, Asemota examines the Kingdom of Benin and palace rites, such as the annual Igwe festival, which plays prominence to the head. And he also employs his understanding of the history of Victorian Britain and uses particular objects and materials like kaolin chalk, known as orue, or coal or coral beads, mirrors, and other objects with associations in the culture to recall history, particularly the 1897 attack on the kingdom of his origin. In 2009, Wole Soyinka writes in his memoirs, You Must Set Forth at Dawn, about his personal attempt to recall some of Nigeria's looted objects in the mid-1970s. Emeka Ugbo, sound and installation artist, created 200 posters depicting the Benin bronzes in the city of Dresden in Germany to draw attention to the city's role in maintaining the legacies of colonialism. This project was supported by the Ethnological Museum in Dresden and depicted 5 works from their collection. Ugbo's work comes a few years after the joint exhibition titled Boundary Objects held at Kunsthaus Dresden in 2015 and organized by a Berlin-based activist group Artifact. Alongside other artists like Sami Balaji, Penny Siopis, I showed my work titled Columns of Memory, showing how objects acquire meaning other than what they were originally intended as they move from one place to another. So in 2003, I was invited to join the Broken Memory Project, which was initiated by Paris-based anthropologist Bernard Moulet. This project led us to conduct research on the impact of the removal of sacred objects on communities from where these objects were plundered in Africa. So I went to Benin for field work and focused on the casters and also asked them what they remembered of the British expedition to Benin and how the removal of these objects from the kingdom affected them as artists. And they spoke of how they now resort to copying images from books and catalogs and how they had no opportunity of seeing these looted works because they didn't have funds for international travel. So it was from there I was invited to contribute an essay and write captions for the catalog for the Benin Kings and Rituals Court Arts from Nigeria catalog. It was a traveling exhibition which opened in Vienna and was shown in Berlin and Paris and closed in Chicago over a 2-year period. So I returned to Nigeria after viewing the Vienna and Chicago exhibitions to see that there was nothing in the press referring to this exhibition in Nigeria. I then decided to do more work on this vexed issue of looted art to bring awareness to the Nigerian public about these contested artifacts. And as an artist, I long to create a body of work that will engage with this history and to contribute to the ongoing discourse about the ownership of contested Benin patrimony. So in 2010, my solo exhibition, Benin1897.com, Art and the Restitution Question, opened. The project was concerned with issues regarding copyright, identity, and ownership of Benin objects. Museums not only show looted art as their own, but collect revenue for copyright of images derived from these arts. Recently, there was the launch of the Digital Benin project, and one of the issues that has still not been resolved is who owns the digital assets deriving from this huge archive of Benin looted art. In terms of the display of Benin art, Nigerians ought to be able to appreciate their art within the confines of their country rather than learn about their culture by visiting Western museums. This sentiment has been expressed by the French President Emmanuel Macron in 2017. The name Benin1897.com refers to Benin as the location, 1897, the date, and .com, like the domain name, commercial, underlines commerce as the main reason Benin was attacked. It also refers to the co-modification of Benin objects on the international market. In terms of the catalog documentation, I thought it was important to bring scholars from Africa together to represent their views. And one of the articles was written by Kwame Okpoku, a foremost writer on restitution matters and a strong voice from the continent. The foreword was written by His Royal Majesty Oba Jawa, and the book also contained a lot of appendices, letters that have been written requesting for the objects. And so I'll go on to discuss some of the works that were shown in this exhibition. The first one is the title piece, 1897.com, which comprises 1,000 terracotta heads placed in a similar manner in which the soldiers found the artifacts when they made their way into the palace. So each ancestral head is an embodiment of an ancestor. Every king was expected to raise an altar in veneration of the past king. And in these altars, you had his heads, and these were memorial sites where the history of the lineage was recounted and recalled in veneration of the dynasty, in veneration of the king. The British soldiers desecrated these altars by yanking off the memorial heads from their initial location. The looted heads were made of brass, while those in this installation were made of laterite, which is the same material used for making the altar beds. So, in terms of the exact number of looted Benin arts, it's unknown. Usually, there are speculations that it's between 3,000 to 5,000, or even up to 10,000. However, in this installation, I have about 1,000 heads, which was sufficient to show the scale of theft that was carried out by British soldiers, because the entire gallery floor was covered up with the 1,000 terracotta heads. And today we find that we have over 900 works in the British Museum and over 1,000 in German museums. And the works are spread across over 200 institutions globally. And this does not cater for the collections that you find in private hands. So the installation also captures moments in history. When the British soldiers arrived in the palace, they laid siege in the courtyard, and on the third day, the palace of the king was gutted in fire. And to record this episode, black oxides were introduced to the heads, which are made as a way of capturing this inferno that engulfed the palace. And we can still find some of the ivories showing some of the marks, these burn marks, on display in Western museums. Checkered history speaks of the fragmentation of Benin art, culture, and history occasioned by the expedition. The work draws on the textures of several Benin brass plaques and uses the motifs and textures found on them. These textured tiles are arranged in squares in a checkered fashion. Like a chessboard, Africa then becomes the playground for world powers. And so we move on to the next work, which is the Theater of War, made of terracotta, and it provides information about the events that occurred during the attack, which were recorded by British soldiers themselves as they made their way into Benin. It tells of the commands that went in all directions, the number of villages that were burned, the number of ammunitions that were expended, and the number of people that were killed on a daily basis. Long Live the King is an installation proposing a new way of commemorating kings in Benin. Gourds were used as receptacles for keeping sacrifices, and they were also, in this installation, I used it as historical markers for various kings. So each gourd represented each year since the expedition. So we had about 113 gourds, and each of the gods had symbols associated with particular kings. So what I did here was to bring in a bit of my personal history to capture the design on a commemorative cloth that was done in 1978, designed by my mother to mark her father's funeral of Akenzo II. So I transferred those patterns onto the gourd as a way of registering that as the king's emblem. And so we also have 17 of these gourds painted in plain colors to mark the period of interregnum when there was no king in Benin, since the Oba that was met by the British was exiled to Calabar, where he died in 1914. Beyond this 2010 exhibition is the 2014 Whose Centenary Public Art project, which I curated. And this was focused on the centenary amalgamation of the Southern and Northern Protectorate of Nigeria. It opens with a rhetorical question. And so as artists, we wondered about why Nigeria would celebrate an occasion like this that was not a very palatable one for Nigerians. It was part of the colonization process. The project yielded a new body of works in new media, performance arts, installation, painting, photography. I invited 10 other artists to take part in this project. And so we went to Benin And for me, it was important that we did this iteration in Igun Street to celebrate the lives of these artists, the bronze casters who had kept the traditions alive, who have kept the name and the renown that Benin has in the arts. And so we decided, rather than to commemorate the amalgamation, but to celebrate the passing of His Royal Highness Oba Ovorame, the King of Benin, who stood against British imperialism in the defense of his kingdom. That was worth celebrating. And so the activation was in Igun Street. We were in the midst of bronze casters in their ateliers and their home. And so the artists moved freely doing their performances, outdoor performances and installations along the street. We also involved the Edo artists who were trained in a particular canon, the traditional casters, and they worked with artists who were academically trained. And together we worked on this project, which was novel. So the artists were able to draw from the casters, taking some of their bronze works and installing them in their own performances. And so we moved very freely within the environment without disrupting the work of the artist. And in some cases, we even installed a video in one of the ateliers. Jude and Nogui had this beautiful installation, video installation in one of the galleries of the artist. So these are images from the Whose Centenary projects. Igun Street with the arch, and then the performers singing and moving right into the street to do their various iterations. We wanted to celebrate the music, the songs, the chants, and the sounds of Benin. And so we had this procession from the house in Akenzo Street all the way down to the palace and to several other historical sites. We stopped at those points, celebrating Benin, celebrating the culture. And here we have my mother, Princess Elizabeth Olu, in performance with Wara Natasha Ogunji and Bonds Effiom, who was a member of a family that took care of Obavarame, who was exiled. For him, this was not a mere performance, this was some kind of duty that he thought he owed the king. We had two photographers, Andrew Esebo and Ines, who um, had taken photographs from the archive in 1974 and superimposed it with the photograph they had taken of the same house in Benin City in Igun Street, and we found some of the casters there who appeared in 1974 working in the house. We also had on-site paintings by Victor Ehikamenon and renowned performance artist Jalili Atiku raised an altar for Ovorame. He titled his performance Holy Ovorame Cathedral. He discounted all Christian religious icons, took the bronze objects from the casters and used that as symbols of his church. So here we find him setting up for a church service where he invited people to come celebrate the life of Oba Ovorame. And he had done several other performances in the past. Rosson's boat he had performed in 2010, and he took images from my installation for that performance, which he later did in 2018 in Bordeaux, France. So the installation I had in 2010 was mounted along the corridors of the palace of the head of the Guild of Brass Casters. I was interested in taking that installation back to Benin. For me, that return, that physical return was very important. And I wanted to have this installation against the adobe walls of the head of the Guild of Casters, or even in the palace of the king, in a rustic space, not in a white cube. And so for me, it was a beautiful collaboration we had here because I invited also the bronze casters who brought in some of the valuable bronze casts and they put them into the installation, and it instantly transformed it into a collaborative project which had a life of its own. So in 2018, I was in a residency in South Africa and I engaged with this same theme of expropriation, but bringing it up to speed with other cases of pillage that had gone on elsewhere in Africa, like Ethiopia, the Coptic crosses and the religious emblems and items that were taken during the Battle of Magdala in 1868, and the raid of the Ashanti region, where a lot of gold treasures were taken in 1874. And so, in this exhibition, I also tried to look at the story of expropriation, the story of Sarah Batman. And for me, I was not just looking at the story of the request for objects, but also looking at the request for bones and human remains. And this is typified by the story of Sarah Batman, which was a very traumatic story, a story of pain and trauma associated with the body of a woman who was kept in a human zoo and in Europe, and her body was returned to South Africa for burial in Hanki. So I created this work showing her body, but I didn't want to be accused of the same gaze that put her in that situation. So I turned the body upside down and surrounded her body with images of the Coptic cross, the gong, the gold weights and gold objects from Ghana. And this was a four-piece panel. And so that takes us to two exhibitions that I took part in Germany. Dan Hicks, in his new book, British Museums, questions the rights of Western museums to show Benin objects which should be considered as an extension of the ultra-violence that occurred in 1897. So many museums responded to this call and offered the return of objects, and those who had objects took them down from display. And in some cases, there were museums that offered to show their works for the very last time before repatriating them. So I took part in this curation. It was a co-curated project for the exhibition titled Resist, the Art of Resistance at the Ratosstratios Museum in Cologne. It was an experimental process of engaging 4 independent curators to curate individual rooms, which are autonomous spaces within the larger context of the theme, which was focused on resistance and violence during the colonial period. So I also worked with 96 Benin bronzes that were taken directly from the expedition and were acquired within 2 years. And so this collection were kept in the room, and I was to work with them. The Benin objects in this museum had not been shown to the public. Only 3 of them had been shown to the German public, and that means that 93 of them were kept away in storage for several decades. So the objects were displayed in the same way they would have been kept in storage, and that elicited a lot of discussions and questions from the visitors who wondered why this unusual display was done in the museum. And so there were no captions, so it made you focus on the objects themselves and to ask questions about the provenance of these Benin objects in Cologne. I had never had such close contact with any of the Benin bronzes. And for the first time, I physically touched one of the bronzes, one of the sculptures which inspired me to write a poem, which I titled, I Have Come to Take You Home. In that poem, I referred to memory sites and shrines where these objects would have traveled from. And it was very interesting to know that when the Benin materials came in from Cambridge and Aberdeen, when they were returned to the palace, the king took these objects back to the very place where they would have been yanked off from, the shrines in Ugauba. and rededicated them and reconnected them to the very familiar space. So, as is customary for a lot of the projects that I do on Benin, I invited artists again into this autonomous space, artists that have followed for several um, years in my work, my advocacy work on Benin. And so we had cartoons by one of my students who was inspired by the 2010 Benin 1897.com exhibition. He made a series of cartoons and talked about double standard, which speaks volumes about how the debate on restitution is handled when it comes to the case of Africa. And so we also have the works of Alao Lukman, who keeps referencing the bronze plaques. And like other artists before him, Ben Ewonwu, Bruce Onobrakpaya, and Airboy Mokpai, these plaques have inspired and continue to inspire a younger generation of artists. So his works bring to the fore the multidimensional aspect of metalworking and the depth of technical know-how shown by Edo craftsmen in their understanding of other metalworking processes such as riveting, sawing, piercing, and wirework, in addition to the lost wax technique. And I was invited to curate yet another exhibition, which I will come back to, which is titled I Miss You. Other works in this exhibition featured the works of Osaze Amadasu. He made a series of playing cards and he switched the imagery of English kings and queens on cards and replaced them with images of Benin kings and the Queen Mother, Iyobani Yesigi. And it leads us playfully into understanding the intricacies of the Edo culture and celebrating it in style while making a commentary on Benin as a playground for colonial powers. Wakuso Edozien delicate line drawings shows a superimposition of images of Benin classical objects on everyday scenes in the city, showing that the past is very much a part of the future. And so we go on to the I Miss You exhibition, which is ongoing, still in the Rattlestar US Museum. And the emphasis on this exhibition was to look at these Benin objects. And in, in looking at these objects, you are made to think about the provenance, the trauma, the loss, and the grief associated with the absence of Benin materials from the communities that produced them. Again, these works were shown without captions, but different from the previous exhibition, they were mounted and displayed in showcases as significant materials. And so, without the captions, you're made to think about the objects that were kept in the showcases. There was no caption to direct the viewer in any particular direction. The gallery space was dark, and this recreated the hallowed space of the shrines from where these works will have been taken. And in the middle of the display was a video showing my hands taking off the ascension marks from the Benin objects. So in conclusion, I've shown a large range of works in different genres, and these works have been done by artists from very early, from about the 1960s, and it shows that the absence of Benin material has generated a lot of artistic creation. And one can only think about the possibilities that exist when these works return to Nigeria, when they return to Benin, that it will also inspire a large number of people, a younger generation of people, to create even more. So I'm going to conclude this presentation by showing you a video where my hands are working over the Benin bronze, taking away the ascension marks. These marks sometimes are very small, other times you have 3 or 4 marks on an object, showing how the work has moved from one place to the other, from the collector to the auctioneer to the museum. And in some cases, the marks are so large that, in a sense, they are also a form of violence to the objects. And in this video, we see the symbolic removal of these marks that have been put on these works, uh, envisaging that these works will return to Nigeria where they belong. I thank you for your attention.